The November rain fell heavy on Thornhill Manor that evening in 1849, drumming against the tall windows of the master bedroom, where James Thornhill III lay dying. The room smelled of laudanum and decay, expensive candles doing little to mask the scent of death that had settled into mahogany furniture and silk curtains over the past 3 weeks. James was 52 years old, though he looked 70. Tuberculosis had ravaged his once imposing frame, leaving behind a skeletal figure barely recognizable as the man who built one of Virginia's largest tobacco empires. His breathing came in wet, rattling gasps. His skin had taken on the yellow-gray pallor of someone who'd already begun the journey away from the living. But his mind remained sharp, terrifyingly sharp. Around his bed stood the witnesses to what would become the most controversial deathbed declaration in Virginia history. His wife Adelaide sat rigid in a chair by the window, her face a mask of aristocratic composure that barely concealed 20 years of accumulated bitterness. She was 47, still beautiful in the severe way of women who'd learned to turn disappointment into dignity. Dr. Marcus Wendell stood near the headboard, periodically checking James's pulse with professional detachment. He'd been the Thornhill family physician for 30 years and had delivered the news no one wanted to hear 2 months ago. Nothing could be done. James had perhaps 8 weeks. 2 lawyers occupied chairs near the fireplace. Richard Blackwood and Thomas Creighton, both from a prestigious firm that had handled Thornhill affairs for 2 generations. They had ledgers, documents, fresh ink waiting. They'd been summoned to record James's final arrangements. And then there was Sarah. She stood near the door, as far from the bed as possible while still being in the room. Her presence there was itself scandalous. Enslaved people didn't belong in master bedrooms, especially not during such intimate family moments. But James had insisted, had screamed for her when the family tried to refuse. Sarah was 23 years old, her belly enormous with a child due within days. She was what plantation society called a house Negro, light-skinned with features that suggested mixed ancestry somewhere in her family line. Her mother had been a field hand. Her father's identity was uncertain, though rumors suggested he'd been the overseer who died in a riding accident when Sarah was 5. She'd worked in the Thornhill house since she was 12, first in the kitchen, then as a lady's maid at Adelaide, though that arrangement had ended 8 months ago when Sarah's pregnancy became obvious. Now she lived in a cabin behind the main house, in a kind of limbo, not quite relegated to the slave quarters, but certainly no longer welcome in the house proper. Everyone in the room knew the child was James's. The entire county knew. It wasn't even particularly unusual. White masters impregnating enslaved women was so common as to be unremarkable. What was unusual was James's visible torment about it. His insistence on Sarah's presence now. The way he looked at her was something that resembled actual remorse. James's hand trembled as he gestured for water. Adelaide didn't move. Dr. Wendell brought a glass to his lips. James drank, coughed violently, blood speckling the white handkerchief he pressed to his mouth. When he could speak again, his voice was surprisingly strong. Blackwood, Creighton, I'm ready to dictate my final arrangements. The lawyers moved closer, pens poised. The Thornhill estate, James began, speaking slowly to allow them time to write, comprising 8,000 acres, the manor house, tobacco warehouses in Richmond, investments in railroad stock, and all chattel property, including 214 enslaved persons, shall pass to my nephew Charles Thornhill upon my death, with specific conditions to be detailed. Adelaide's face showed nothing, but her hands tightened in her lap. Charles was James's sister's son, a mediocre young man of 25 who'd spent more time gambling in Richmond than learning estate management. But he was the closest male relative. There were no direct heirs. Or rather, there was one. Everyone's eyes flickered to Sarah. However, James continued, and something in his tone made everyone lean forward. Before we proceed with the bulk of the estate, I have other matters to address. Matters of conscience. Dr. Wendell exchanged glances with the lawyers. Deathbed confessions could complicate inheritance proceedings enormously. James turned his head toward Sarah. Sarah, come here. I need you closer for what I'm about to say. She moved forward reluctantly, her hand protective over her belly. When she stood within a few feet of the bed, close enough to see the death in his eyes, James spoke again. Everyone in this room knows the truth. The child Sarah carries is mine. Conceived in March of this year, during a period of weakness, and sin that I will answer for before God in a matter of hours or days. Adelaide made a small sound. Dr. Wendell looked uncomfortable. The lawyers wrote furiously. I could ignore this child, James said, his breathing becoming more labored. I could let him be born into slavery, raised in the quarters, worked in my fields until his body gave out the way thousands of others have. That would be the easy path, the socially acceptable path. He paused for another sip of water, gathering strength. But I cannot do it. I have committed many sins in my 52 years. I have bought and sold human beings. I have separated families. I have profited from suffering. But I will not add this particular sin to my accounting. I will not enslave my own child. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Adelaide stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. James, you cannot be serious. You're going to acknowledge this bastard? You're going to humiliate me publicly by... Adelaide. His voice cut through her objection. Sit down. I'm not asking your permission. I'm informing you of my decision. She remained standing, her face flushed with rage and humiliation, but she said nothing more. James returned his attention to the lawyers. I hereby declare that the child Sarah will bear within the next week is my biological offspring. Upon birth, the child shall be immediately manumitted. I have prepared documents declaring the child free, regardless of the mother's status. This was extremely unusual but not unheard of. Masters occasionally freed the children they fathered with enslaved women, though usually quietly and without public acknowledgement. Furthermore, James continued, I established a trust fund of $25,000 for the child's benefit. The fund shall be managed by Blackwood and Creighton, with distributions made for the child's education, welfare, and eventual establishment in business or trade when he comes of age. The child shall receive proper schooling, as much as a free person of color can obtain in Virginia. $25,000 was an enormous sum, more than most white families saw in a lifetime. The lawyer's pen scratched across paper, recording every word. Sarah, James said, turning to her again, I cannot give your child legitimacy. Virginia law prohibits it. I cannot give him my surname in any official capacity, but I can give him freedom and resources. I can give him chance. Sarah's eyes were wet with tears. Thank you, Master James. Thank you for... Don't thank me, he interrupted, his voice suddenly harsh. Don't thank me for doing the bare minimum that decency requires. I'm giving this child what I should have given others. I've fathered at least 4 other children with enslaved women on this property over the years. 3 are dead. 1 was sold south when I needed cash 5 years ago. I did nothing for them. Nothing. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Everyone had suspected, but hearing it stated so baldly was shocking nevertheless. This child, James said, his breathing becoming more difficult. This child will be different. He'll be free. He'll be educated. He'll have money. But... He paused, and his face contorted with something that looked like genuine fear. But there's one condition. One absolute requirement that must be followed. Everyone waited. James's next words came out with desperate intensity. Do not name this child after me. Do not call him James. Do not give him any variation of my name. Not James, not Jimmy, not anything connected to Thornhill beyond the financial arrangements I've established. The request was bizarre. Usually, masters who acknowledged illegitimate children were proud to have them carry some version of the family name. It was a way of claiming them without legally legitimizing them. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Master James, why would you forbid? Because I know what happens, James interrupted, his voice rising to something close to a shout before collapsing into a coughing fit that lasted nearly a minute. When he could breathe again, he continued more quietly. I know what happens when our blood mixes in this way. When a child carries a name he has no legal right to carry. When he exists between worlds, belonging to neither. He was looking at something beyond the people in the room now, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. I've seen it, in dreams these past months, as the sickness took hold. I've seen what happens if this child carries my name. 3 generations of suffering. 3 generations of tragedy, following anyone who bears the name Thornhill through mixed blood. The name becomes a curse instead of a legacy. Dr. Wendell stepped forward. James, you're feverish. These dreams are they're not just dreams. James's hand shot out with surprising strength, grabbing the doctor's wrist. They're visions, warnings. I've seen my son's life if he carries my name. I've seen his children's lives. I've seen suffering that makes our present sins look merciful in comparison. He released the doctor and turned back to the lawyers. Write this down. Make it part of the legal documents. The child Sarah bears shall receive all benefits I've described, but only if he is not named James, not named for me in any way. If Sarah violates this condition, the trust is forfeit. The money goes to Charles instead. Sarah's face showed confusion and hurt. But, Master James, I thought you'd want your son to carry your name. I thought it would be an honor to. It's not an honor. James was shouting again, blood flecking his lips. It's a curse. I'm trying to protect him. Why won't any of you understand? Adelaide spoke from her position by the window, her voice cold. We understand perfectly, James. You've lost your mind. Consumption has reached your brain. You're raving about curses and visions like some superstitious field hand. Believe what you will, James said, sinking back into his pillows, exhausted. But heed my words. Do not name that child after me. He looked at Sarah one final time. Promise me. Whatever name you choose, make it something entirely different. Promise me you'll protect our son from the burden of a name he cannot carry. Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she didn't understand. I promise, Master James. I'll name him something else. Good. James closed his eyes. Blackwood, Creighton, you have everything recorded? All the provisions, all the conditions? Yes, Mr. Thornhill, Blackwood confirmed. It's all documented. Then I'm finished. Get out. All of you except Dr. Wendell. I'm tired. They filed out slowly. Adelaide first with her head high, then the lawyers gathering their papers. Finally, Sarah with one last backward glance at the man who'd fathered her child and was now dying full of mysterious warnings. Only Dr. Wendell remained. He checked James's pulse again, adjusted his pillows, prepared another dose of laudanum for the pain. Marcus, James said quietly, do you think I'm mad? The doctor considered the question carefully. I think you're dying, and dying men often experience vivid dreams and visions. Whether those visions have meaning beyond your own guilt and fear, I cannot say. I am guilty, James admitted, and I am afraid, not of death. I'm afraid of what I've set in motion, afraid of what will happen despite my warnings. Why do you think she'll defy you? Wendell asked. Sarah seemed sincere in her promise. James laughed bitterly. Because she thinks a name is a gift. She thinks I'm being modest, that my warnings are just fever dreams. She's young. She doesn't understand how heavy a name can be, how it can become a weight that crushes rather than uplifts. And if she does name the child after you, then God have mercy on that boy and everyone who comes after him. James Thornhill III died 3 days later on November 19th, 1849, at approximately 3 a.m. Dr. Wendell recorded the cause as consumption with complications from pneumonia. His final words, heard only by the doctor who attended him in those last moments, were, I warned them. I tried to protect him. Why won't anyone listen? Sarah gave birth on November 22nd, 3 days after James's death. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from the slave quarters and, surprisingly, by Adelaide herself. The plantation mistress arrived at Sarah's cabin unannounced during the worst of the contractions, sent away the other women, and helped deliver the child with her own hands. The baby was a boy, perfect, healthy, with the distinctive pale blue eyes that marked the Thornhill bloodline. Adelaide wrapped the infant in fine linen, far better than anything typically used for enslaved children. She placed him in Sarah's arms and stood watching them both for a long moment. What will you name him? Adelaide asked, her voice carefully neutral. Sarah looked down at the infant, at those blue eyes that were so clearly his father's legacy. She thought about James's warnings, his desperate pleas that the child not carry his name. But she also thought about how James had acknowledged his child, had freed him, had given him wealth that would ensure a future. A name was honor. A name was legacy. A name meant this child wouldn't be forgotten or erased the way so many mixed-race children were. James Thornhill had been afraid, dying and delirious. But Sarah understood what he couldn't. The name was protection. The name was identity. The name was the one thing she could give her son that would mark him as belonging somewhere. James, she said firmly. I'm naming him James Thornhill IV. Adelaide's face showed no emotion, but something flickered in her eyes. Satisfaction? Vindication? Are you certain? Adelaide asked. My husband specifically requested. Your husband was dying and frightened, Sarah interrupted. He didn't know what he was saying. This child deserves his father's name. It's the only real inheritance a bastard child can receive. Adelaide nodded slowly. Very well. James Thornhill IV. I'll inform the lawyers. The child still receives the trust, of course. The conditions only stated he would forfeit the money if named after James. Since you've chosen to do so anyway, the legal arrangement stands. She moved toward the door, then paused. Sarah, my husband said he saw 3 generations of suffering, that the name would be a curse rather than a legacy. Do you know what I think? Sarah shook her head, holding her infant closer. I think he was right, but not because of any supernatural curse, because of something much simpler. A child with that name, with mixed blood, with money but no social standing. He'll belong nowhere. Rejected by whites for his birth, resented by enslaved blacks for his privilege. The name James Thornhill will become a target on his back, a reminder of everything the society doesn't want to acknowledge. Adelaide opened the door. But you've made your choice. Let's see if my husband's warnings were prophecy or merely the ravings of a guilty conscience. I suspect we'll have our answer within a generation. She left. Sarah sat alone with her son, with little James Thornhill IV, and tried to ignore the cold feeling settling into her stomach. She'd done the right thing. She was sure of it. The child deserved his father's name. Didn't he? Now, I want to ask you something before we continue. What do you think about what we've seen so far? Was Sarah right to defy James's dying wish? Or was his warning something she should have heeded? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on this impossible choice. The funeral of James Thornhill III was held on November 21st, 1849, 2 days before his son was born. It was a grand affair befitting one of Virginia's most successful planners. Over 300 people attended, filling the small Episcopal church in the county seat and spilling out onto the grounds. The Reverend Thomas Whitfield delivered a eulogy that carefully avoided mentioning James's more controversial final acts. He spoke of a successful businessman, a pillar of the community, a man who'd built an empire from Virginia soil. He did not mention the deathbed declaration. He did not mention Sarah. He certainly did not mention the imminent birth of an acknowledged bastard child. But everyone knew. Whispers rippled to the crowd like wind through wheat fields. The scandal was already spreading across Virginia's plantation society with the speed that only truly shocking gossip can achieve. Adelaide sat in the front pew, dressed in perfect morning black, her face composed. She'd spent 20 years as James Thornhill's wife, enduring the humiliation of being childless in society that measured a woman's worth by her fertility. And now, in death, her husband had given another woman what Adelaide herself had never managed to produce. An heir, that the heir was illegitimate mixed race, and legally unable to inherit the estate proper didn't make the humiliation any less acute. If anything, it made it worse. James had acknowledged his bastard, while Adelaide's failure to bear children remained glaringly obvious. Charles Thornhill sat beside her, the 25-year-old nephew who would inherit everything. He was trying to look appropriately somber, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows, calculating. 8,000 acres, 214 enslaved people, tobacco warehouses, railroad stock, He'd gone from being a marginally employed younger son of a minor branch of the family to being one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, all because his uncle had died without legitimate heirs. But even Charles had heard about the deathbed declaration, about the trust fund established for an unborn child. $25,000 that would never come to Charles, diverted instead to a baby whose only crime was being born to the wrong mother. After the funeral, the lawyers gathered in the Thornhill Manor library with Adelaide and Charles to begin reading the formal will. The provisions were exactly as James had dictated on his deathbed, all properly recorded and witnessed. The bulk of the estate to Charles. Generous provisions for Adelaide, ensuring she could maintain her position as long as she lived. Specific bequests to loyal servants and employees. And then the explosive paragraph about the child to be born to Sarah. "This is madness," Charles said after Blackwood finished reading. Uncle James was out of his mind. Consumption had reached his brain. "We need to challenge this will, have it declared invalid based on mental incompetence." Adelaide shook her head. "We can't. The deathbed declaration was witnessed by myself, Dr. Wendell, and both lawyers. We all heard James speak coherently and deliberately. A court would uphold it. But $25,000 to a slave's bastard." Charles was pacing now, agitated. "That's my inheritance he's giving away." "Technically," Creighton interjected carefully, "it's James's money to dispose of as he wishes. The $25,000 comes from his personal holdings, not from the estate itself. You're still receiving everything else." "Everything else except my dignity." Charles spat. "How am I supposed to hold my head up in society knowing my uncle preferred a mixed-race bastard over his own family?" "The child isn't preferred over you," Blackwood said. "You're receiving the estate, the property, the enslaved workforce, everything that matters. The child is merely receiving money and freedom." "Merely?" Charles laughed bitterly. "As if freedom and $25,000 is merely anything." Adelaide had been quiet during this exchange, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Now she spoke. "Charles, I suggest we don't challenge the will. Let the bastard have his money. Let him have his freedom. Neither will protect him from what's coming." Charles looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that my husband, in his final guilt-ridden state, may have thought he was protecting this child, but he's actually condemned him to something far worse than slavery." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Thornhill grounds. "A slave knows his place. He belongs to the system, horrible as it is. He has the protection of being property. He's valuable. But a free Negro with money? He belongs nowhere. He'll be resented by enslaved blacks for having what they don't. He'll be hated by poor whites for having resources they lack. He'll be rejected by wealthy whites for his birth. And all of that before we even consider the name." "The name," Charles repeated. Uncle James was raving about the name. Some nonsense about a curse if the child was called James. "It wasn't nonsense," Adelaide said quietly. "It was the most sensible thing my husband said in his final days. A mixed-race child named James Thornhill will carry that name like an open wound. Every time he introduces himself, every time someone asks about his family, he'll have to explain. He's a Thornhill, but not a Thornhill. He has the name, but not the legitimacy. He has the blood, but not the inheritance." She turned back to face them. "So, yes, let him have the money. Let him have his freedom. Let Sarah name him whatever she wishes. Because the real curse isn't supernatural. It's social. And there's no amount of money that can protect against that." The lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Blackwood cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thornhill, we should inform you that Sarah gave birth 3 hours ago. A healthy boy. She's already named him." Adelaide smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Let me guess. James Thornhill IV." "Yes, ma'am. Against your late husband's explicit wishes." "Of course she did. She thinks the name is honor. She doesn't understand it's a noose." 2 days later, Adelaide did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She visited Sarah's cabin, carrying gifts, fine baby clothes, a silver rattle, a beautifully bound Bible. Sarah was sitting up in bed, nursing the infant, when Adelaide entered without knocking. Sarah immediately tried to rise. to show proper deference, but Adelaide waved her back down. "Stay where you are. You've just given birth. You need rest." Adelaide set the gifts on a small table and moved closer to examine the baby. Little James was nursing contentedly, his blue eyes occasionally opening to stare at the world with the unfocused intensity of newborns. "He has my husband's eyes," Adelaide said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "And you've named him James, despite my husband's specific request that you choose any other name. I meant no disrespect, Mrs. Adelaide, but I thought Master James was just frightened. Sick and frightened. I thought giving the baby his name would honor him, would give my son something to be proud of." Adelaide sat down in the room's only chair. "Did my husband ever tell you about his youth? About the first woman he loved?" Sarah shook her head. "He was 19 years old," Adelaide began, her voice taking on the quality of someone telling a story she'd held inside for too long. "His father was still alive then, master of this estate. There was a girl, enslaved, about 17 years old. Her name was Rachel. She was beautiful, educated. She'd been trained as a lady's maid for James's mother." Adelaide paused, choosing her words carefully. "James fell in love with her. Real love, or at least what 19-year-old boys believe is real love. He talked about freeing her, marrying her, running away north where such things were theoretically possible. His father discovered the relationship, as fathers always do." Sarah listened, the baby now sleeping in her arms. What happened was brutal. Rachel was pregnant. James's father separated them immediately. Rachel was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. The child, a girl, went with her. James never saw either of them again. He tried to find them, spent years trying, but they'd been sold again or died, or simply disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery that swallows people whole. "I didn't know," Sarah whispered. "No one knows. It was covered up the way these things always are, but it destroyed something in James. He became harder after that, colder. He married me 3 years later, not because he loved me, but because his father told him to. I produced no children in 20 years of marriage. And then at 51 years old, he did it again. He got involved with someone he shouldn't have. He created another child who would exist in the impossible space between worlds." Adelaide leaned forward. "So when my husband lay dying and begged you not to name this child after him, it wasn't fever talking. It was experience. It was memory. It was the knowledge of what happens to children who carry names they cannot fully claim." "But Miss Rachel's child," Sarah said, "what happened to her? Did she suffer because of her father's name?" Adelaide's smile was sad. "Rachel never told the child who her father was. She gave her a different name entirely, raised her as just another enslaved child. That girl, James's daughter, is actually still alive. She's 32 years old now, enslaved on a plantation in Alabama, with children of her own who'll never know they carry Thornhill blood." The revelation hung in the air between them. "Your son," Adelaide continued, "will know exactly who his father is, will carry his father's name publicly, will have money and freedom that should make him fortunate. But he'll also have the burden of being constantly compared to a legacy he can never fully claim. People will say James Thornhill, and think of my husband, of Charles, of the family line. And then they'll look at your son and see the qualifier, the bastard James Thornhill, the mixed James Thornhill, the one who doesn't really count." Sarah's arms tightened protectively around her son. "What are you saying, Mrs. Adelaide? That I should rename him? The documents have already been filed." "No, it's too late for that. And besides, you've made your choice. You think you're giving him pride. You'll discover you've given him a burden." Adelaide stood to leave, then turned back. "One more thing you should know. Rachel, before she was sold away, did something that people whisper about to this day. She was from the Caribbean originally, captured and brought here as a child. She knew practices, beliefs from her mother's people, spiritual things that the overseer's whip couldn't beat out of her. Voodoo." Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Some called it that. Others called it root work, or hoodoo, or any number of names. Whatever the truth, Rachel did something before she was taken away. She stood in the center of this plantation at midnight, and she pronounced words that several enslaved people heard and remembered. Adelaide's voice dropped lower. She said, "Any child of Thornhill blood who cannot claim the Thornhill name will suffer. Any child who carries a name without the right to it will suffer worse. 3 generations will pay for the sins of the father. The name will be a curse, not a legacy, until the bloodline acknowledges what is done." Sarah felt cold despite the warm room. That was 30 years ago. Yes, and my husband never forgot it. He believed it. On his deathbed, he saw it repeating. He saw your son claiming the name Rachel's daughter never did. He saw the pattern starting again. "You don't believe in curses, do you, Mrs. Adelaide?" Adelaide smiled. "I believe in the cruelty of societies that create impossible situations for innocent people. Whether you call that a curse or just call it life under slavery, the result is the same. Your son will suffer for the name you've given him, not because of supernatural forces, but because of very human prejudices and hatreds." She opened the door. "But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe your little James will defy all expectations and live a charmed life. Stranger things have happened." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Sarah sat alone with her sleeping son, with little James Thornhill IV, and tried to quiet the fear growing in her heart. She'd done the right thing. The name was honor. The name was identity. The name meant her son mattered. But Adelaide's words kept echoing. The name will be a curse, not a legacy. And somewhere in the back of Sarah's mind, she could hear her own master's dying words. "Do not name that child after me." Too late now. The choice was made. The name was recorded. Little James would grow up as James Thornhill IV. And whatever that meant, whatever consequences would follow, Sarah would face them. She had to believe she'd chosen correctly. She had to. Thank you so much for staying with this story so far. I know it's heavy, complex, full of painful truths about a dark period in American history. But I promise you, the best is still to come. The story of how this curse or burden, or whatever we want to call it, played out across generations is absolutely fascinating. So stay with me. James Thornhill IV lived in a social purgatory from his first breath. He was born free in 1849. Technically a person with legal rights in a society built on the premise that people who looked like him had none. He had money, $25,000 in trust, an enormous sum that should have guaranteed security and opportunity. He had his father's distinctive features, those pale blue eyes that clearly marked him as legitimate Thornhill blood. Even a society would never acknowledge that legitimacy. But he belonged nowhere. Sarah raised him in the cabin behind Thornhill Manor for the first 5 years of his life. It was an awkward arrangement. She was still technically enslaved, though James Thornhill had included provisions for her care and eventual manumission. Once young James reached age 16, Charles had honored those provisions, barely, providing Sarah and her son with adequate housing and food while keeping them at arm's length from both the slave quarters and the main house. Young James's earliest memories were confusion. The enslaved children in the quarters wouldn't play with him. They called him free boy and master's mistake when they thought he couldn't hear. The white children were even worse. At church on Sundays, where Sarah attended the segregated services required of all the plantation's residents, white children would point and whisper and laugh. "That's the bastard," James remembered hearing when he was 4 years old. "That's the one old Mr. Thornhill made with a slave woman. Mama says he thinks he's better than us, but he's just a black boy with money." By age 6, young James understood he was different. His mother explained it carefully, in terms a child could understand. His father had been James Thornhill III, a great man who'd loved James enough to give him freedom and money. But his father's family, the White Thornhills, couldn't claim him as one of their own because his mother had been enslaved. "Am I white or colored?" James asked his mother one night. Sarah held him close. "You're you, baby. You're James. That's all that matters. But which church do I belong in? The white one or the colored one?" Sarah had no good answer. In 1854, when James was 5, Sarah finally received her own manumission papers. Charles Thornhill signed them without ceremony, eager to be done with the uncomfortable reminder of his uncle's sins. Sarah and James moved to Richmond, where the growing free black community offered at least a possibility of finding a place to belong. It was better than the plantation, but not by much. Richmond's free black community was tiny but proud, made up of skilled tradesmen, small business owners, and a few families who'd achieved remarkable prosperity despite Virginia's increasingly restrictive laws. But even there, James was an outsider. His light skin made some people suspicious. His money made others resentful. And his name, James Thornhill, marked him as exactly what he was, the illegitimate child of a white master, carrying a name he had no legal right to claim. Sarah enrolled him in a small school for free black children run by a Quaker couple. James proved to be brilliant, reading by age 5, doing complex mathematics by 7. His teachers marveled at his quick mind. They also worried about his social isolation. He doesn't connect with the other children, the teacher told Sarah when James was 8. He tries, but they keep him at a distance. And Mrs. Washington, I need to be frank, his name causes problems. When he introduces himself as James Thornhill, it raises questions. Some parents have asked if he's actually free, or if he's a runaway using a false name. His name is his father's, Sarah said firmly. It's the one gift his father could give him. I understand, but you might consider whether that gift is helping or hurting him. At 10 years old, James began to understand the full weight of what his mother had chosen for him. He was walking through Richmond's Market District with Sarah when they encountered Charles Thornhill and his wife Lavinia. Charles was in town on business. He stopped when he saw James, stared at him for a long moment, then turned to his wife. That's him, Charles said, not bothering to lower his voice. That's the bastard Uncle James spawned. Look at those eyes. No denying the blood, even if the law does. Lavinia studied James with cold curiosity. He carries your uncle's name? Unfortunately, Uncle James made provisions that I couldn't challenge. The boy has money, freedom, and a name he has no right to use. Shameful, Lavinia said. Come, Charles. Let's not associate with such people. They walked away. James stood frozen, his mother's hand tight on his shoulder. Don't listen to them, Sarah whispered. They're just bitter. You have every right to your father's name. But James was starting to doubt that. By 15, James was reading law books, trying to understand his own legal status. Virginia law was explicit. Children followed the condition of their mother. Sarah had been enslaved when James was born, which meant James would have been born enslaved too, except for his father's specific manumission documents. Those documents freed James. They established his trust fund, but they didn't make him legitimate. They didn't give him legal claim to the Thornhill name or inheritance. They didn't make him anything except a free person of color in a state that was making life increasingly difficult for free people of color. The Virginia legislature had been passing restrictive laws for decades. Free blacks couldn't testify in court against whites. They couldn't own firearms. They needed special papers to travel. They could be kidnapped and sold back into slavery with minimal legal recourse. They lived under constant suspicion, constant surveillance, constant threat. And James, with his light skin and his famous name and his unexplained wealth, lived under special scrutiny. At 16, James came into his trust fund, $25,000, carefully invested and grown to nearly $30,000 over the 16 years. The lawyers who'd managed it since James Thornhill III's death presented it formally, along with stern warnings. This is a fortune, young man, Richard Blackwood said. He was older now, grayer, but still practicing law. Used wisely, it could establish you in business, provide for your future. Used foolishly, it will attract every scoundrel and con artist in Virginia. What would you recommend I do? James asked. Leave Virginia, Blackwood said bluntly. Take your mother and go north. Pennsylvania, New York, somewhere that free people of color have actual opportunities. Here, you'll always be tainted by your birth. The Thornhill name, which your mother thought would be an honor, is actually an anchor around your neck. But James didn't leave. Not yet. He invested $10,000 in a tobacco warehouse in Richmond, partnering with a white businessman who needed capital and was willing to overlook James's birth in exchange for his money. He bought his mother a comfortable house. He lived modestly, trying to build a life. For 3 years, it seemed to work. The tobacco business was profitable. James was making connections, earning respect as a sharp businessman with an eye for quality leaf. People started calling him Mr. Thornhill instead of the bastard or the mixed boy. He was 20 years old and thinking maybe, just maybe, he could make this work. Then disaster struck. The white partner in James's tobacco business absconded with the assets in 1869. He emptied the accounts, sold off inventory, and disappeared into the chaos of post-Civil War Virginia. James lost everything he'd invested. $10,000 gone. The legal system offered no recourse. James couldn't testify in court against a white man. The lawyers advised him to accept the loss and move on. James tried again. He used his remaining funds to open a small lending business, offering loans to Richmond's black community at fair rates. It was needed service and profitable. Within 2 years, James had rebuilt some of his fortune. Then came the violence. In 1871, during the turbulent Reconstruction period, white terrorist groups were attacking successful black businesses throughout the South. James's office was burned to the ground one night. All records destroyed. Several clients beaten. A note left on the door. No Negro banker in Richmond. Know your place. James lost everything again. He was 23 years old and starting over for the 3rd time. "Mama," he said one night, sitting in their Richmond house, "maybe Mr. Blackwood was right. Maybe we should leave Virginia." "And go where?" Sarah asked. She was 45 now, graying, worn down by decades of watching her son struggle. "You think it'll be different somewhere else? You'll still be who you are. You'll still carry that name." "Maybe I should change it. Drop the Thornhill part. Just be James Washington. Take your family name." Sarah looked horrified. "You will not. Your father gave you that name, that identity. It's the only claim you have to what, Mama? To a family that won't acknowledge me? To a legacy I can't inherit? Mama, I'm starting to think you made a mistake. I'm starting to think my father knew something you didn't when he begged you not to name me after him. Don't you dare." 3 times. James was shouting now, years of frustration pouring out. 3 times I've tried to build something. 3 times it's been destroyed. Every time because of who I am, what I represent. The name doesn't protect me, Mama. It targets me. It marks me as someone who doesn't fit, someone who challenges the social order just by existing. Sarah was crying. "I thought I was giving you pride. I thought I was honoring your father." James's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen. He moved to hold his mother. "I know, Mama. I know you did what you thought was best. But I'm starting to understand what Father saw in those deathbed visions. He wasn't seeing a supernatural curse. He was seeing the future. My future. The life of someone who carries a name that makes them simultaneously too black for whites and too white for blacks." In 1872, James finally left Virginia. He moved to Ohio, to Cleveland, where the black community was larger and more established. He started over again, this time as a shipping clerk, working his way up through a legitimate company that didn't care about his complicated family history. At 24, he met Clara Dennison, a freeborn black woman from a respectable Ohio family. They courted carefully. Clara was cautious about James's Virginia background, about his unusual appearance, about the questions that seemed to follow him. But she also saw his intelligence, his determination, his fundamental decency. They married in 1873. James was 25. Clara was 22. For a while, it seemed like maybe James had finally escaped whatever had been following him. Their first child, a daughter they named Catherine, was born in 1874. Healthy, beautiful, with Clara's darker skin and James's blue eyes. Their second child, another daughter named Elizabeth, was born in 1876. Then tragedy struck again. In 1877, a cholera outbreak swept through Cleveland. It hit the poorer neighborhoods hardest, the areas where black families lived in crowded conditions with inadequate sanitation. Catherine died first, at age 3. Elizabeth died 2 days later, at 18 months. Clara survived the disease, but never recovered from the grief. She became withdrawn, depressed, barely able to function. James threw himself into work, desperate to provide, to make enough money to move them to a better neighborhood, to protect whatever was left of his family. In 1878, their third child was born, a son, Thomas. He was healthy, and Clara seemed to revive slightly with a new baby to care for. James had learned his lesson about names. He would not name his son after himself, would not pass on the burden of the Thornhill name to another generation. Except Clara insisted. "We need to honor your father," she said. "We need to show that you're proud of who you are, where you come from." "You don't understand," James argued. "My father specifically asked that no one be named after him. He saw something, knew something." "That was 40 years ago, James. Your father was dying, probably delirious. You built a good life here. We have a beautiful son. Giving him your name would honor both your father and you." They argued for weeks. Finally, exhausted and grieving and desperate to make Clara happy, James agreed. The boy was named Thomas James Thornhill. James signed the birth certificate with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. It was just a name, just 2 words on a piece of paper. But he remembered his own father's warnings, remembered Adelaide's prophecy, remembered every disaster that had befallen him over 30 years of life. That night, James had a dream. His father appeared to him, looking exactly as he must have looked on his deathbed, wasted, terrified, desperate. "I told you," dreamed James III said. "I warned you. 3 generations. The curse passes through the name. Your son will suffer as you've suffered. His children will suffer until someone breaks the chain." James woke in a cold sweat. Clara stirred beside him. "Bad dream?" she asked sleepily. "Yes," James whispered. "A very bad dream." But it wasn't just a dream. James knew, with the certainty that comes from lived experience, that he'd just made the same mistake his mother had made 30 years earlier. He'd passed on the burden of the name, and his son Thomas would pay the price. James Thornhill IV died in 1901 at age 52, the exact same age his father had been at death. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him said he died of exhaustion, of fighting battles that couldn't be won, of carrying a name that had never fit properly. His final words to his son Thomas, delivered from a hospital bed in Cleveland, were eerily similar to those his grandfather had spoken to his mother. "Don't name your children after me," James said, his breathing labored. "Don't pass this on. The name is a burden, not a legacy. Your grandfather tried to warn my mother. I tried to warn your mother. But neither of us listened. Please, Thomas, learn from our mistakes." Thomas held his father's hand and promised. "I won't, Father. I'll break the pattern." But Thomas was already 23 years old. He already carried the middle name James. And he was about to discover that some patterns are harder to break than others. The curse, if curse it was only 1 generation deep. 2 more generations waited. Thomas Thornhill grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1880s and 1890s, watching his father struggle against invisible barriers that Thomas didn't fully understand as a child. He knew his father was always tired, always worried, always fighting something that seemed to follow him from job to job, city to city, opportunity to opportunity. James had moved the family 6 times during Thomas's childhood. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Detroit, back to Cleveland, then Columbus, then Cleveland again, each move prompted by some disaster. A business failure, a violent incident, a mysterious reversal of fortune just when things seemed to be improving. Why'd we have to move again? Thomas asked when he was 12, watching his mother pack their belongings for 4th time. Clara looked at her husband. James was at the window, staring out at nothing. He'd just lost another job, the lumber company closing suddenly, taking his invested savings with it. "Your father has bad luck," Clara said quietly, or something like it. Thomas grew up believing his father was cursed with misfortune. It wasn't until he was 15, sitting with his dying grandfather at that hospital bed in Cleveland, that he learned the full story. His father told him everything. About James Thornhill III and Sarah. About the deathbed warning. about Rachel's supposed curse from 30 years before that, about every business failure, every tragedy, every inexplicable reversal that had marked James IV's life. And you believe it? Thomas asked. You believe in curses? I believe in patterns, James said. Whether you call it a curse or just call it the accumulated weight of an impossible situation, the result is the same. I've spent 52 years being James Thornhill IV, and it's destroyed me. Don't let it destroy you. After his father's death, Thomas took the family's remaining resources, about $2,000, and made a radical decision. He moved them to Minnesota, about as far from Virginia as he could get while remaining in the United States. Minneapolis, a growing city where almost no one had heard of the Thornhill family, where Thomas could be just another young black man trying to make his way. He dropped the Thornhill name from daily use. He went by Thomas Washington, using his grandmother Sarah's family name. He found work as a bookkeeper for a grain storage company. He was good with numbers, reliable, careful. He saved money. He built a life. At 25, in 1903, Thomas met Margaret Chin, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd settled in Minneapolis after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. She was 19, intelligent, beautiful, and completely outside the complicated racial dynamics of American black and white relations. Their courtship was controversial on multiple levels. A black man and a Chinese woman together challenged all society's carefully maintained categories. But Thomas found that refreshing. Margaret knew nothing about the Thornhill family history. She didn't care about curses or warnings or deathbed prophecies. They married in 1904. Thomas didn't tell Margaret about his family's supposed curse, didn't mention his father's warnings or his grandfather's deathbed plea. He was determined to prove that the pattern could be broken by simply ignoring it, by refusing to believe in it. Their first child, a daughter, was born in 1905. They named her Lily. She was healthy, thriving, a perfect blend of her parents' features. Their second child, another daughter, was born in 1907. They named her Rose. Thomas was 30 years old. He had a good job, a loving wife, 2 healthy daughters, and a comfortable home in Minneapolis. For the first time in the Thornhill bloodline in 3 generations, it seemed like things were working out. Then Margaret got pregnant again in 1909. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Margaret was sick constantly, losing weight instead of gaining it. The doctor was concerned, but not alarmed. Sometimes pregnancies were just harder than others. The baby was born in March 1910. A boy, healthy despite his mother's difficult pregnancy. Thomas held his son and felt overwhelming relief. They'd gotten through the difficult part. Margaret would recover. Their family would be complete. What should we name him? Margaret asked from the hospital bed. She was weak, pale but alive. Thomas had been thinking about this for months. His father had warned him not to use the name James. His own middle name was James, but he'd rarely use it, preferring to be just Thomas. He could give his son any name. Break the pattern completely. Thomas, Margaret said. We should name him after you. Thomas Chin Thornhill. Or we could use your full name, Thomas James. No, Thomas said quickly. Not James. Anything but James. Margaret looked confused. Why not? It's your middle name. It's a family name. Because... Thomas hesitated. How could he explain without sounding insane? How could he tell his rational, practical wife that he believed in a decades-old curse? Because I want him to have his own identity, not be named after me or my father or anyone else. That's sweet, Margaret said. But I think we should honor your family. Your father sounds like he was a good man who worked hard, and your grandfather before him. Giving our son that legacy seems right. They debated for days. Thomas held firm against using James, but Margaret was equally firm about honoring the Thornhill family line. Finally, they compromised. The boy would be James Thomas Thornhill. James as the first name, Thomas as the middle name. Margaret chose it because she thought it honored both Thomas's father and Thomas himself. Thomas signed the birth certificate with hands that trembled. James Thornhill V, the 5th generation, to carry some version of that curse name. It's just a name, Margaret said, seeing his distress. "You're being superstitious." "Probably," Thomas agreed, but he didn't believe it. For the first 5 years, everything seemed fine. Little James, called Jimmy by the family, was a bright, energetic child. He talked early, walked early, was clearly intelligent. Lily and Rose doted on their baby brother. Margaret recovered from the difficult pregnancy, and the family thrived. Then came 1915. Jimmy was 5 years old when he developed a strange illness. It started with fever and lethargy. The doctor diagnosed scarlet fever, common enough in children but dangerous. They treated it with the standard protocols of the time: rest, fluids, quarantine. Jimmy survived, but barely. He spent 3 months bedridden, hovering between life and death. When he finally recovered, he'd lost significant weight and developed a persistent cough that the doctors couldn't explain. "He'll grow out of it," the doctor said. "Children are resilient." Thomas wasn't so sure. He remembered his father talking about disasters that followed the name. This felt like the beginning. In 1916, when Jimmy was 6, he was playing with neighborhood children when a horse-drawn wagon's brake failed. The wagon rolled down a hill, heading straight for a group of 4 boys. 3 of the boys were crushed and killed. Jimmy survived because, at the last moment, he bent down to tie his shoe. The wagon missed him by inches. Thomas heard about the accident and felt cold dread settle into his bones. It wasn't just that Jimmy had survived. It was the pattern. Tragedy touching him but not killing him. Others dying while he lived. It was too familiar. Margaret refused to see it as anything but coincidence. "We should be grateful he's alive, not looking for sinister patterns where none exist." But Thomas knew. He'd heard too many stories from his father about similar near misses, about disasters that struck close but not quite close enough. The curse, if that's what it was, didn't kill the name bearer outright. It tormented them. Jimmy's childhood was marked by one inexplicable incident after another. When he was 10, he was falsely accused of stealing money from his school. The real thief was eventually caught, but not before Jimmy had been publicly humiliated and expelled for a week. When he was 13, he fell through ice while skating, spending 20 minutes in freezing water before being rescued. The doctor said it was miraculous he survived. When Jimmy was 15, he witnessed a murder. He was walking home from school when he saw 2 men arguing in an alley. The argument escalated. One man pulled a gun, shot the other. Jimmy was the only witness. He testified in court, helping to convict the murderer. But the murderer's family blamed Jimmy. They threatened him. The family had to move to a different neighborhood for safety. Margaret finally started to worry. "This isn't normal, is it? The amount of trouble that seems to find our son." "No," Thomas said. "It's not normal." "Then what is it?" "It's the name." Thomas finally told her everything. The whole family history. James Thornhill III and Sarah. The deathbed warning. James Thornhill IV's life of repeated disasters. The pattern repeating across generations. Margaret listened to the entire story, her face moving from skepticism to concern. "And you believe this?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know what I believe, but I know the pattern is real. My grandfather saw it. My father lived it. And now our son is living it too. Then what do we do?" "I don't know." In 1925, when Jimmy was 16, something happened that finally made Thomas understand the full scope of what his family was dealing with. Jimmy had survived to 16 despite everything. He was a serious young man, quieter than most teenagers, marked by the things he'd survived. He read constantly, studied hard, seemed determined to understand why his life had been so difficult. One day, Thomas came home to find Jimmy in his study, surrounded by papers, old letters, the family Bible, documents Thomas had kept hidden for years. "I found these in your desk," Jimmy said. Letters from grandfather James, documents about the estate in Virginia, birth certificates going back 3 generations. Thomas's heart sank. "Jimmy, those are private." "I know what I am," Jimmy interrupted. "I know about the Thornhill family. I know about James Thornhill III and Sarah. I know about the curse, or whatever you want to call it. I've been trying to understand why my life has been the way it's been, and now I know." Father and son stared at each other. What are you going to do? Thomas asked. I'm going to Virginia, Jimmy said. I'm going to find out the truth. I'm going to understand where this started and why it's still affecting me 75 years later. Jimmy, I'm not asking permission, Father. I'm 16. In 2 years, I'll be an adult. But I can't wait 2 years. I need to understand this now. Thomas tried to stop him, tried to argue that Virginia was dangerous for a young black man, that digging into the past would only make things worse. But Jimmy was determined. In the summer of 1925, James Thornhill IV traveled alone to Virginia, following a trail of documents and family stories back to where it all began. What he found there would finally reveal the truth behind 3 generations of suffering, and would give him the key to breaking the curse once and for all. James Thornhill V arrived in Virginia in July 1925, traveling by train from Minneapolis through a landscape that changed gradually from the relatively progressive North to the deeply segregated South. By the time he crossed into Virginia, the social rules had transformed completely. He was 16 years old, traveling alone, carrying letters from his father and grandfather, birth certificates, legal documents proving his connection to the Thornhill family. He also carried something else, a deep need to understand why his entire life had been marked by inexplicable tragedy. Jimmy's first stop was Charlottesville, the closest city to where Thornhill Manor had once stood. He found a boarding house that accepted black guests and began his research at the county courthouse. The clerk, an elderly white man named Morton, looked at Jimmy with obvious suspicion when he asked for records relating to James Thornhill III. What business does a colored boy have with the Thornhill family? Morton asked. Family research, Jimmy said carefully. I'm writing a school paper about prominent Virginia families. Morton's expression suggested he didn't believe this story, but he shrugged. The Thornhill estate records are public, as much as anything from that era is. You'll find them in the basement archive. Jimmy spent 3 days in that basement, reading through dusty ledgers and documents by dim electric light. He found his grandfather's manumission papers, dated 1849, found the trust fund establishment, found Adelaide Thornhill's careful records documenting every penny spent on Sarah and her child. He also found something else, a separate collection of documents that had been stored with the Thornhill estate papers but seemed to predate James Thornhill III's death. Personal letters kept in a lockbox that had been opened and refiled after Adelaide's death in 1882. The letters were from James Thornhill III to a lawyer in Richmond, written between 1820 and 1823. They detailed a youthful romance that had ended in tragedy. They mentioned Rachel by name. They described James's desperate attempts to find her and his daughter after they'd been sold away. But they also mentioned something Jimmy hadn't known about, something no one in his family had known about. James Thornhill III had kept a journal during his final illness, a journal that Adelaide had hidden away, possibly because it contradicted her public position that James had been delirious in his final days. Jimmy requested to see the journal. Morton looked even more suspicious now. How did you know about a journal? That's not in the public records. It was mentioned in one of the letters. Jimmy lied smoothly. Morton disappeared for 20 minutes. When he returned, he was carrying a leather-bound book that looked like it had been sitting untouched for decades. You can read it here. Can't take it with you. Jimmy opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but still readable. James Thornhill III's handwriting was elegant, educated, the script a man who'd had the best tutors money could buy. The journal began in October 1849, just a month before James's death. The entries were sporadic, written when James had strength and clarity. October 12, 1849. The consumption is taking me quickly now. Dr. Wendell says I have perhaps 6 weeks. I find myself haunted not by death itself, but by the fear that I will die without breaking the cycle I set in motion 30 years ago. I was 19 when I met Rachel. She was 17, brought to our plantation from the Caribbean with her mother when she was a child. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was extraordinary. She could read, though it was forbidden. She knew medicine, herbs, healing practices her mother had taught her. She had a strength of spirit that should have warned me I was dealing with forces beyond my understanding. I loved her. I believed love would be enough. I believed we could run away, go north, build a life where such things were possible. How naive I was. My father discovered us when Rachel was 4 months pregnant. What followed was brutal, even by the standards of our brutal world. Rachel and her mother were sold to separate plantations in Mississippi. My daughter, Rachel's daughter, went with her. I never learned what happened to the child. I spent years trying to find them, but they disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery that consumes people whole. What I didn't learn until much later, what I've kept hidden even from Adelaide, is what Rachel did the night before she was taken away. Jimmy read faster, his heart pounding. October 20th, 1849. I must record this before I lose the strength. I must explain what I only recently learned from Caesar, one of our oldest enslaved men, who was present that night in 1820. Rachel's mother was a practitioner of what the enslaved called the old ways, spiritual practices from Africa and the Caribbean, knowledge passed down through generations. The overseers called it voodoo, hoodoo, devil worship. But it was something else, something older than those dismissive names. The night before Rachel was sold, she and her mother performed a ceremony in the center of the plantation. Several enslaved people witnessed it. Caesar was one of them. He never told me because he feared punishment, but now that I'm dying, he felt compelled to share the truth. Rachel pronounced words in a language Caesar didn't recognize. Then she spoke in English, words that the witnesses remembered perfectly because they were so specific, so deliberate. James Thornhill has broken something that cannot be mended. He has loved without the courage to protect what he loves. He has created life without the power to shelter it. For this, there will be consequences. Any child born of Thornhill blood who cannot claim the Thornhill name in law shall carry a burden. Any child who carries the name without the right to it shall carry a greater burden. 3 generations will struggle with this inheritance. The first generation will know prosperity denied. The second generation will know death that lingers. The third generation will know truth that could have freed them all. Caesar says Rachel looked directly at my father's house when she spoke the next part. Only when the truth is spoken, when the hidden is revealed, when the family acknowledges what it has done, can the burden be lifted. 3 generations will pass. Then the choice comes. Jimmy's hands were shaking as he read. This wasn't superstition. This wasn't coincidence. Rachel had pronounced a specific curse with specific conditions and specific timing. 3 generations. His grandfather, James IV, had been the first generation. Prosperity denied. Every business failure. Every reversal of fortune. Jimmy had heard those stories. His father, Thomas, had been the second generation. Death that lingers. The daughter who died. The near misses. The constant shadow of tragedy that never quite killed, but never quite released either. And Jimmy himself was the third generation. Truth that could have freed them all. The journal continued. October 30th, 1849. I am dying with knowledge I cannot share openly. Adelaide would call me mad. Society would say I'm delusional from the disease. But I know Rachel's words were true. I've seen the pattern already beginning. Sarah's pregnant with my child. I convinced myself this time would be different. This time I could protect the child, give him freedom and resources, ensure he had the life Rachel's daughter never did. But I've realized my mistake. The curse wasn't punishment. It was prophecy. Rachel saw what would happen to children born between worlds, carrying names they cannot fully claim. She saw the social forces that would crush them. Whether she invoked spiritual powers or simply understood human nature better than I did, the result is the same. I will not name this child after me. I will try to break the pattern before it starts. But I fear Sarah will not understand. I fear she will see the name as honor rather than burden. If I am right, and if Rachel's prophecy is true, then my child, my grandchild, and my great-grandchild will all suffer. 3 generations. The truth must be revealed. The family must acknowledge what it has done. Only then can the curse be broken. The journal ended a few days before James Thornhill III's death. The final entry was barely legible. November 15th, 1849. I am out of time. Sarah has agreed not to name the child after me. I pray she keeps her word. But even if she does, Rachel's curse may already be in motion. My first daughter, Rachel's child, carries Thornhill blood. If she has children, if they have children, the curse follows the bloodline whether the name is used or not. I die with this knowledge. I set something in motion in 1820 that will not end until 1925, 3 generations from my child's birth. Only when the truth is revealed, when someone has the courage to dig up what I've tried to bury, can the cycle be broken. May God forgive me for what I've done to my children and my children's children. Jimmy sat in the courthouse basement, staring at his great-grandfather's final words. This year, this moment, he was a 3rd generation, the one who needed to find the truth. He already had the truth in his hands. But what was he supposed to do with it? Jimmy spent the next 2 weeks in Virginia. Following leads from the journal, he found Caesar's descendants, elderly people who remembered the stories passed down about Rachel and her curse. He visited the site where Thornhill Manor had stood, now just foundations and overgrown gardens. He tracked down what records existed about Rachel and her daughter. He found her. His great-aunt, his grandfather's half-sister, was still alive. Her name was Martha. She was 81 years old, living on a small farm in Alabama, a freed woman who'd survived slavery, survived the Civil War, survived Reconstruction. She didn't know she was a Thornhill. Her mother, Rachel, had never told her. Rachel had died in 1855, taking the secret to her grave, determined that her daughter would never carry the burden of that name. Jimmy traveled to Alabama, met Martha, told her everything. Martha listened to the entire story without interrupting. When Jimmy finished, she sat silent for a long moment. "My mother died cursing the name Thornhill," Martha finally said. "She told me on her deathbed that the man who'd fathered me was a Virginia planter named James, but she made me swear never to seek him out, never to claim any connection. She said the name was poison." "She was right," Jimmy said. "The name has been poisoned for 3 generations. But you came here to find me. Why?" "Because the curse can be broken. My great-grandfather wrote about it. Rachel herself specified the conditions. The truth must be revealed. The family must acknowledge what was done. I'm an 81-year-old woman," Martha said. "What family do I have to acknowledge?" "Not you," Jimmy realized. "Me. I'm the 3rd generation. I'm the one who has to reveal the truth. I'm the one who has to make the family acknowledge what it did." "What family? The White Thornhills? They wouldn't accept you if you gift-wrapped yourself." "No. My family. My father, my mother, my sisters. They need to know the whole truth. Not just that the curse exists, but why it exists. They need to understand what James Thornhill III did, what Rachel suffered, what you suffered. The truth can't stay buried anymore." Martha studied him. "And you think revealing all this will break the curse?" "I think Rachel was right about everything else. I think she gave us the way out. Speak the truth. Acknowledge the sin. Face what was done rather than burying it. Then you better start speaking, child, because if you're right, you're running out of time." Jimmy returned to Minnesota in September 1925. He was 17 now, almost 18. He'd spent the summer uncovering 3 generations of secrets. He gathered his family in their living room. His father, Thomas, his mother, Margaret, his sisters, Lily and Rose. And he told them everything. He told them about James Thornhill III and Rachel, about the curse pronounced in 1820, about his great-grandfather's journal, about finding Martha in Alabama, about Rachel's specific conditions for breaking the curse. "So, what do we do?" Thomas asked when Jimmy finished. "We acknowledge it," Jimmy said, "publicly, completely. We stop hiding who we are. We stop pretending the name isn't complicated. We face the truth that the Thornhill fortune was built on slavery, on broken families, on suffering that can't be undone. And then we move forward different. And you think that will break this curse?" "I think the curse is already broken, Father. I think finding the truth, speaking the truth, that's the breaking. The suffering doesn't come from supernatural forces. It comes from secrets, from lies, from families built on foundations of guilt and denial. Once we face that honestly, the pattern can end." Thomas looked at his son, the 16-year-old who'd done what 3 generations before him couldn't do. He'd found the truth, And maybe, just maybe, he was right about what came next. James Thornhill IV's return from Virginia in September 1925 marked a turning point in his family's history, but not in the dramatic way he'd hoped. There was no lightning bolt, no sudden release from decades of suffering. The truth, once revealed, didn't magically solve everything, but it did change the trajectory. Thomas and Margaret listened to their son's discoveries with a mixture of horror and recognition. The story of James Thornhill III and Rachel explains so much. The pattern of tragedy following the name, the specific ways each generation had suffered, the mathematical precision of it all. So what do we do now? Margaret asked after Jimmy finished his account. How do we acknowledge what was done? Do we publish an article? Give speeches? What does breaking this curse actually require? Jimmy had been thinking about this throughout his journey home. I think it requires living differently, not hiding anymore, not pretending the past doesn't exist, not passing as something we're not. Thomas flinched. For 30 years, he'd been trying to escape the Thornhill legacy by using the name Washington, by moving west, by creating distance between himself and Virginia. Now his son was suggesting they embrace what they've been running from. I've spent my whole life trying to protect this family from that name, Thomas said. And you want us to claim it openly? I want us to be honest about it, Jimmy corrected. There's a difference. We don't have to be proud of the name, but we can stop being ashamed of how we got it. Stop pretending it doesn't exist. The family debated for weeks. Lily and Rose, Jimmy's older sisters, had their own opinions. Lily wanted nothing to do with the Thornhill name or legacy. Rose was curious but cautious. Finally, in October 1925, the family made a collective decision. They would acknowledge their full history publicly, but they would also change how they carried forward. Thomas legally changed his name back to Thomas James Thornhill. After 30 years of hiding behind Washington, he reclaimed the name his father had given him, but he did it on his own terms. He wrote an article for the Minneapolis Tribune titled The Truth About American Families. In it, he told the entire story of James Thornhill III, Sarah, Rachel, and 3 generations of children born between worlds. He acknowledged his own identity as the grandson of an enslaved woman and a white plantation owner. He discussed the curse, not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a natural consequence of society built on human bondage. The article caused a sensation. Some readers were outraged. Some were fascinated. Some wrote letters calling Thomas a fraud or an attention seeker. But many more wrote letters saying they recognized similar patterns in their own families, their own hidden histories, their own secrets about mixed-race ancestry that everyone knew but no one discussed. Jimmy graduated from high school in 1927 and enrolled at the University of Minnesota. He decided to study history, specifically the history of slavery and its aftermath. He wanted to document not just his own family's story, but the stories of thousands of families torn apart by the same system. For the first time in 3 generations, Jimmy's life began to stabilize. He wasn't free from challenges. He still faced racism, both casual and systemic. He still dealt with people who viewed his mixed heritage with suspicion or hostility. But the parade of inexplicable disasters that had marked his childhood slowed and then stopped. No more near-death experiences. No more businesses collapsing mysteriously. No more friends dying while he survived. It was as if, by bringing the truth into the open, Jimmy had stepped out of the shadow that had followed the Thornhill name for 75 years. In 1931, at age 22, Jimmy met Alice Morrison, a Howard University graduate who'd moved to Minneapolis to teach at a school for black children. She was brilliant, politically active, involved in the early civil rights movement. She was also fascinated by Jimmy's family history. "You're walking proof," Alice said during one of their first conversations, "that the racial categories this country depends on are completely artificial. You're black and white and everything in between. You carry a name that should belong to Virginia plantation aristocracy. Your great-great-grandfather enslaved your great-grandmother. How is society supposed to categorize someone like you?" "I don't think society can," Jimmy said. "That's why the curse existed in the first place. The system couldn't handle people who didn't fit its categories." They married in 1932. Jimmy was 23. Alice was 24. They had clear-eyed conversations about the challenges of their future together, about bringing children into a world still deeply divided by race, about whether the Thornhill name should continue. What would you name a son? Alice asked during their engagement. Not James. Jimmy said immediately, that cycle needs to end. Not Thomas, my father's name. Something completely new. David, Alice suggested. It means beloved. No historical baggage. Just a clean start. When their son was born in 1933, they named him David Freeman Thornhill. Freeman after the concept of freedom. Thornhill to acknowledge where they came from without being bound by it. David grew up hearing his family's complete history. Nothing was hidden. He knew about James Thornhill III and Sarah, about Rachel's curse, about the 3 generations of suffering that had preceded his birth. But he also grew up without the burden of those expectations. I'm the 4th generation, David told his father when he was 12 years old. Does that mean I'm past the curse? There is no curse, Jimmy told his son. There never really was. There was just a pattern of trauma, of secrets, of families unable to face their own history honestly. Once we faced it, once we told the truth, the pattern could change. David went on to live a remarkably successful life. He became a doctor, graduating from Howard University Medical School in 1955. He married a woman named Ruth Chun, no relation to Jimmy's mother Margaret, but an interesting coincidence. They had 6 children together. None of David's children carried the name James. The youngest, born in 1975, was named James David Thornhill, but only as a middle name, not as a primary identity. He went by David Jr. and never experienced the kinds of tragedies that had marked previous generations. Jimmy himself lived to age 89, dying in 1994. He'd spent his adult life as a historian, specializing in the history of slavery and its aftermath. He'd written 3 books, including one called Names and Burdens, 3 Generations Under Shadow, which told his family story in full. Before he died, he recorded oral histories with his children and grandchildren, ensuring the truth would survive him. Was it really a curse? His granddaughter asked during one of these recordings. Or was it just bad luck and racism? Jimmy thought carefully before answering. I think Rachel had real power. Whether you call it spiritual or psychological, she understood something deep about human nature. She understood that secrets destroy families, that guilt unacknowledged becomes generational trauma, that children born into impossible situations will struggle in specific, predictable ways. She gave us a formula, not a curse, but a map. Speak the truth. Acknowledge what was done. Face the sin. Only then can healing begin. Did you heal? Yes, Jimmy said. Not perfectly, not completely, but yes. When I found the truth in that courthouse basement in 1925, when I shared it with my family, when we stopped hiding, the pattern broke. The weight lifted. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. And do you forgive them? James Thornhill III, your great-grandfather? For what he did to Rachel and Sarah. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. I understand him. I understand being trapped by a system you didn't create, but benefit from. I understand loving someone you're not allowed to love. I understand the cowardice of choosing comfort over courage. I don't have to forgive him. That's not my role. But I can tell his truth. I can make sure his warnings, which everyone ignored, finally mean something. And Rachel? Do you think she ever forgave him? No, I don't think she did. I think she saw clearly what he was. A man who loved her but not enough. Who wanted to protect their child but not enough to actually fight the system. I think her curse was both spiritual and practical. A prediction of what would happen. And a warning about what systems like slavery do to everyone they touch. But the curse ended with you finding the truth. The curse ended with all of us choosing to live differently. With my father reclaiming the name instead of hiding from it. With me documenting the truth instead of burying it. With your father, David, living openly, proudly, without shame or secrets. That's how curses break. Not with magic words. With changed lives. Jimmy died in November 1994, almost exactly 145 years after his great-grandfather James Thornhill III died in that same month in 1849. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, descendants of all the major figures in his story. White Thornhills from Virginia, who'd made tentative contact in the 1970s after reading Jimmy's books and realizing they had black relatives. Descendants of Sarah, even one very elderly woman who claimed to be Martha's great-granddaughter, connecting Jimmy to Rachel's line. The eulogy was delivered by David, Jimmy's son. My father spent his life breaking a curse that 3 generations had carried, not through prayer or ritual, but through truth and courage. He showed us that the most powerful magic is honesty. The most powerful weapon against inherited trauma is knowledge. James Thornhill III warned everyone not to name his child after him, but his warning was ignored. 3 generations suffered because of that choice. My father, the 3rd generation, finally understood what James III had been trying to say. Not that the name itself was cursed, but that a name carried without full acknowledgement, without truth, without the courage to face history, becomes a burden. Today, in 1994, there are 14 people alive who carry Thornhill blood through James III and Sarah. 8 more who carry it through James III and Rachel. We gather at this funeral as a family, finally acknowledging all our branches, all our complicated connections. The curse is broken, not because someone waved a magic wand, but because we chose to tell the truth. Years later, in 2019, the Thornhill family descendants held their first official reunion. Over 100 people attended, representing 5 generations since Jimmy broke the curse. Black, white, Asian, Latino, doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, blue-collar workers. A family that would have been impossible under slavery, proving that the system that tried to divide them had ultimately failed. At that reunion, they unveiled a memorial plaque. It listed the names: James Thornhill III, Sarah Washington, Rachel, Martha, James Thornhill IV, Thomas Thornhill, James Thornhill V, David Thornhill, all the generations who'd struggled under the weight of a complicated history. The inscription read, "A family divided by slavery, cursed by secrets, freed by truth. May we never forget the cost of dishonesty, the power of acknowledgement, or the importance of speaking the names of those history tried to erase." Below that, a quote from Jimmy's final recorded interview. The real curse wasn't the name or in Rachel's words. It was in the silence. The moment we started speaking the truth, the curse began to break. So here we are, at the end of this remarkable journey through 3 generations of an American family living under the shadow of a curse that was both supernatural and completely human. Was Rachel's curse real? Did she invoke spiritual powers that caused decades of suffering? Or was she simply a woman who understood human nature well enough to predict what would happen to children born between worlds in a society built on racial division? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the important truth is that curses break when we find the courage to tell the truth, when we stop hiding from our histories, when we acknowledge the people who were hurt, the sins that were committed, the patterns that repeated across generations. James Thornhill III tried to warn everyone, "Don't name that child after me." But no one listened until his great-grandson Jimmy, 3 generations later, finally understood what was being said. The name wasn't the curse. The silence was. What do you think? Was this a supernatural curse or a pattern of social forces and unhealed trauma? How many families carry similar secrets, similar burdens, similar patterns passed down through generations? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of story that deserves conversation, reflection, deep thinking about how history shapes us, whether we acknowledge it or not. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family's hidden histories, if it challenged your understanding of how the past affects the present, please subscribe to this channel. We tell stories like this regularly. Complex, nuanced, historically grounded stories about real human experiences. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. And keep these conversations going, because stories like Jimmy Thornhill's deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from. And now, I recommend you watch our next video, where we explore another fascinating story about families, secrets, and the long shadows cast by American history. Click on the screen now and continue this journey with us.